Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll talk about how important it is to assess risk in the business decisions that we make, and I'll show you how to use the Failure Modes and Effects Analysis tool, or FMEA, to measure that risk. Now, there are a couple other lessons where we dive into the area of risk, so it's important that you at least be very familiar with those before jumping into this lesson. But for now, let's quickly review again the role that risk plays in our business decisions.
Well, if you recall, we had the example of the jelly beans where we're trying to evaluate how many red jelly beans there are in the jar. Well, we said there were a couple of methods. The first method was we can empty out all the jelly beans and manually count the red ones. Well, the advantage of that was we're going to have a very accurate answer, but the disadvantage, it was going to take a lot more time. Then we said the second method was we're going to count the red ones in a small sample and multiply the ones that are in our sample across the whole jar's volume. Well, the advantage of this is going to take a lot less time, but the disadvantage, it was going to be less accurate in comparison. So which method of counting the red jelly beans is best? Well, again, we said that neither was really best because they're both equally valid methods, but the best method really depends on risk versus reward. So risk is determined by the disadvantages for each of those methods that we might employ. So we said for the first method, from a risk perspective, we would be looking at the disadvantages. Is the reward worth the risk of taking more time to use this method? If the reward was just $1 million, then we'd say that perhaps the risk is worth the time for ensuring that we're getting a more accurate answer. For method 2, though, the disadvantage was being less accurate. Well, is the reward worth the risk of being less accurate to use the method? Well, if the reward was a t-shirt, then perhaps the risk of being less accurate is worth it in taking less time. So remember, if we went over the ABC model, well, in that example, we talked about how risk is a critical part of what influences our beliefs. And that's what influences our beliefs affects our conclusions and our actions. So this is where we had the evidence scale here, where we would try to understand what are those things that we're using as our ultimate arguments and the weight of those arguments that help influence how we're going to believe in something, and the things and what we believe, how that affects our conclusions, actions, behaviors, and ultimately our consequences. So this is a part of understanding that risk is very important for us and the decisions that we make and how it influences our decisions and eventually influences our actions and behaviors.
All right, now let's take that step a little bit further and try to answer why risk is so important.
Why do we care so much about risk? Well, risk really affects every single decision that we make. So as a simple example, if you've got a car, well, would you drive your car if you knew that there was a high risk it was going to break down? Well, chances are you wouldn't. However, if you knew that there was an emergency where you had to get yourself or maybe a loved one to the hospital as fast as possible, maybe the risk was worth it. But again, it really depends. The greater risk of some urgent health reason might be worth the other risk of your car breaking down. Either way, risk is a part of what we're using to evaluate the decision we're making. Or another example is maybe you've got a favorite restaurant. Would you eat at that restaurant, even though it's your favorite one, if you knew that there was a high risk of food poisoning? Well, chances are we probably wouldn't if we knew about it. The risk doesn't really change. What really changes in this example is just our knowledge of the potential risk. So really, prudent business decisions should assess and measure the risks that are part of our decisions we're making. So if we use an example like a glass of water, we'll say that the entire glass represents all the possible knowledge and understanding that we could have in trying to make a decision. Well, the filled part of the glass, that is the water, might represent data or confidence in something as part of making that decision. It represents like the evidence we might have to support the decision we're trying to make. The empty portion might represent air. It might represent the assumptions or risk we might have. So the air portion is the part that we don't have a lot of confidence about, or not a lot of data or a lot of evidence behind it. So in the same way, just as adding water to the glass will automatically displace the air in the glass, in the same way as we add data or add evidence to the total body of knowledge that's available, it automatically displaces our assumptions as well. So in this way, we can conclude a few things. Risk has an inverse relationship with confidence. That is, as we get more data, we get more proof or evidence about something, it will automatically build more confidence for us. Also, the lack of data, that is like our assumptions, would create some sort of risk because we don't have as much data to back up the possible available knowledge that we could have had. So in order to reduce the risk and build our confidence, what we need to do is get data. In this way, Six Sigma tools like the FMEA tool we're reviewing in this lesson is a way for us to help assess the risk or the confidence in the business decisions that we're trying to make.
Okay, now let's begin to define what the FMEA tool is and what its layout looks like.
The FMEA tool is a risk management tool that stands for Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. So it's a way of tracking all the possible failures within a process and their potential impact and a plan of how we can mitigate those risks. The FMEA scores and prioritizes all the possible failure modes as a way to help mitigate those potential risks. So here's a general layout of what the FMEA tool looks like, and what we're going to go over now is just some of those key components, and then we'll get into next after that the steps we would use for trying to build this FMEA with a team. So it starts off with this section of process steps, the detailed steps in the new and existing process that are affected by the improvements. And then next we would have this section referring to the failure modes and effects, those potential failures in each process step and the expected effects and severity from those failures. And next we've got this potential causes section. This refers to the potential reasons why a failure occurs and the estimated frequency of that occurrence. Next we've got the current controls and detection section. This is referring to the existing controls that help detect the failures and the estimated capability to detect those failures. And then using all the information from those last three sections helps us to calculate the RPN, which is the risk priority number. This is a value that's used for measuring the severity, frequency, and detection capability for each of those different failures. And the RPN is used as a way to help rank and prioritize all those failures. Then after that we've got a mitigation plan. These refer to the actions and the assigned owners of how we can help mitigate those identified risks from over in this section.
Alright, now let's talk about when you may use the FMEA tool and the process you can follow for building it.
Well, generally the FMEA tool is going to be used when there's a significant process change that requires some form of risk assessment. So it's most often used during the improve phase, like where we're going through this lesson, as part of the DMAIC methodology as a way to evaluate any potential risks from those proposed improvements. Now we can also closely tie it to the control plan that's a part of the control phase of the DMAIC methodology, and this is where we can use that as a necessary step for, again, identifying the potential risks after those improvements have been implemented. And it's also going to be part of the design phase, part of the DMADV methodology before we're implementing the new process that was just designed. Now the FMEA tool is generally built by a team of SMEs, the subject matter experts, during a meeting that could last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. So it's relatively quick turnaround in creating this type of tool. The SMEs should include experts from any area that could be affected by the improvements. And here's some general steps you might follow for conducting the meeting and how we build the FMEA. And it starts with having some sort of input into the meeting, and then the actual process that's going on through the meeting itself, and then we create some sort of output from the meeting. So for the input for the meeting, the input would be the list of the process steps that you want to evaluate for the new process that's being created, or the changes or the new improvements you're making to the process. And then from there we want to identify within the meeting any failure modes and effects, and then we want to identify potential root causes, identify any current controls. And then from that information we're going to have as an output from that meeting the calculated RPN, the risk priority number, and also defining the mitigation plan. Now we might ask ourselves, is this FMEA tool really required for every single project that we implement? Well, I would probably say no. Sometimes the sponsor, the customer, is willing to assume some of the inherent risks that could be involved from the new improvements you're implementing, and they won't want to have a risk assessment done, and that's okay if that's what they want. So when the risks are unknown, or if there's any kind of doubt or suspecting doubt of the success for the solutions that are proposed, then it could be possible the FMEA is going to be helpful for identifying all those potential risks, and we should use the FMEA tool for helping to identify those risks and build a mitigation plan to ensure we've got confidence that these are the right solutions and improvements we want to put in place.
Okay, now let's dig into the 5-step process into more detail and talk about just the first 2 steps.
Well, in the first step, as an input into this meeting, we identify again the list of process steps that we're going to be reviewing. These are the process steps that should be a part of the detailed process map that may have been created as we mapped out the changes in the process based off of these improvements. Each of those process steps should be noted with at least its own step ID number as a reference point for us. Now, it's okay to limit the process steps to only the ones that are really critical or within control of your team if you didn't want to include every single process step. That's perfectly fine. Again, but this would be the type of information that you would use as an input into the meeting. You should already have this mapped out by the time that your meeting starts. So now for the meeting itself, where we're trying to build the FMEA, I'd recommend starting off with a kickoff that may only last about 20 minutes. This is where you're getting the sponsor champion involved in the very beginning to remind everyone again of why you're there, and as a way to also have them come back as a reminder at the end so they can see the end product of building the FMEA tool with your team. Also, the list of process steps should be agreed upon by the team at this time. Make sure that everyone understands at least what those steps are, where they fit into the overall process, and allow for any necessary clarification. Now, the next step here is we want to identify the failure modes and effects. This could take anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes for this section of the FMEA tool. So for each process step, try to brainstorm one or more potential ways that the failure may occur for that respective step. And then try to rank the severity, like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, for each failure mode and effect. Now here's some suggestions you might follow for how you would rank the severity for the failure modes and effects. Now let's walk through all of these. First of all, from a minor perspective, this is where you might give it a value of 1. This is something that might be unreasonable to expect that the minor nature of this failure will have any noticeable effect on item or system performance or subsequent process or assembly operation. Customer will most likely not be able to even detect this failure. That might give it a level of 1. For a rank of 2 or 3, something a little bit more severe, is where it's due to the nature of this failure, the customer experiences only slight annoyance. The customer will probably notice slight deterioration of the item or system performance, or a slight inconvenience with a subsequent process or assembly operation, like minor rework. Now, from a moderate perspective, where we might give it a ranking of somewhere between 4 to 6, this is where the failure causes some customer dissatisfaction, which may include discomfort or annoyance. The customer will notice item or system performance deterioration. This may result in unscheduled rework or repair or some sort of damage to the equipment. Now, at a high level, giving it a ranking of like a 7 or 8, this is where you have a high degree of customer dissatisfaction due to the nature of this type of failure, such as inoperable item or system. The failure does not involve safety or government regulations, though. It may result in serious disruption to subsequent processing or assembly operations, or may require some major rework. Now, for a very high value on this, which is a scale of 9 or 10, the failure affects safety or it involves non-compliance to government regulations, and it may endanger the machine or assembly operator. In this case, you might give it a 9 if it's just a warning, or give it a 10 if this occurs without any warning at all. Again, this is a suggestion, but it's a relatively decent suggestion that you might want to follow as how you determine the ranking you might associate with this particular portion of the FMEA, and that's where you're identifying the failure modes and effects.
Now let's continue looking at the process by digging into the third and fourth step.
When the third step, as we work through our meeting, this is when we want to identify the potential root causes. So this is where we want to say what we think are the potential root causes for each of those failure modes and effects we had just identified. And we want, for each one of those potential root causes, we want to rank the estimated occurrence on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being it's the least frequent, or it rarely ever occurs, up to 10 where it's the most frequent kind of occurrence for that particular root cause. So as we had before, here's a suggestion of how we can define this on a scale of 1 to 10. So what we might call remote, that is giving it a ranking of 1, this is where the failure is unlikely. No failures ever associated with this process, or almost identical processes. So it might be 1 out of 1.5 million of the number of occurrences. So the very low of a ranking of 2, we might say this is where it's only isolated failures associated with this process, or almost identical processes. Well, again, we might give it some objective value of 1 occurrence out of 150,000, 1/10 of what we had defined as remote. For a scale of low, where the ranking is somewhere between 3 to 5, this is where we have isolated failures associated with similar processes. And again, based off of whether we call it a 3, 4, 5, depends on how frequent this kind of thing occurs. For what we're calling moderate, from a ranking of 6 to 7, this process has occasional failures, but not in major proportions. And then for a ranking of high, between 8 and 9, this is where the process or similar processes have often failed. And then for what we're calling very high, at a ranking of 10, this is where failure is almost inevitable. That is, we're giving a ranking of 10 where there's maybe 1 in 3 or even less than 3 where this occurrence happens. And then we move on to the fourth step. After we've identified that kind of ranking for all those potential root causes, we move on to identifying the current controls we have. And this is where we want to define whatever controls that we might have already in place for detecting each of these failure occurrences. So the existing controls can include controls that might be managed by other people or processes outside our immediate team, and that's okay. But what we're trying to really rank here is how detectable those failures are when they occur, even if it's detected by someone else. So what we're going to rank for each of these, again on a scale of 1 to 10, we're going to say where 1 is something where it's always detected, we catch it, and 10 is where we never detect it. So in this case, the better the ability to detect the errors, then the lower the score we might give it. So again, we're going to have another suggestion of how we might rank these as well. So we might say very high, that is very high detection rate. That is giving a lower ranking here of a ranking of 1 to 2. This is where we have current controls that are almost certain to detect the failure mode. Reliable detection controls are known with similar processes, and the process automatically prevents further processing. Now what we're calling high here, high detection rate, with a ranking of 3 or 4, is where we have controls have a good chance of detecting a failure mode, or process automatically detects the failure mode. What we're calling moderate, with a ranking of 5 or 6, this is where we have controls that may detect the existence. It may detect the existence of a failure mode. You notice that word may. It's not as certain as maybe some of these other ones. Now for what we're calling low detection rate, again a rank of 7 or 8, we're saying the controls have a poor chance of detecting the existence of the failure mode. For what we're calling very low, a ranking of 9, we're saying the controls probably will not detect the existence of a failure mode. Now for what we're calling ranking 10, this is where there's absolutely no detection whatsoever. The controls will not or cannot detect the existence of this particular failure that occurs, so no known controls are available to even detect this failure mode. So again, just as we've done before, this is the suggested ranking you might want to use as you work through with your team to identify on a scale of 1 to 10 of how detectable the system is in detecting these types of root causes and failure modes that we've just identified earlier.
All right, now let's wrap up this process by exploring that last step in building the FMEA tool.
And now for our final step, where we have the output from the meeting. This is where we want to calculate the RPN, or the risk priority number, and define a mitigation plan. So that RPN is automatically calculated as a multiplier of those 3 rankings we identified in step 2, which was the severity, step 3, which was the frequency, and step 4, which was the detection capability. So the RPN can range anywhere from the scale of 0 to 1,000 based off of the values that were input. Now that is a wide range, but generally any process step that might have an RPN that's greater than 250 should be considered a potential high risk for failure. So that's where we might want to identify some mitigation plan and take some action. But since the scoring is subjective, then I would recommend that you at least review all the RPNs for everything that you've evaluated so far for all those process steps to determine what would be a reasonable threshold. In case 250 might be considered too low or too high, then you might want to look at all those different RPNs for this process steps to see if there's a different reasonable threshold you need to define for what you might consider a potentially high risk of failure. So after that, you'd want to go through those items that are high risk, and you want to consider building a mitigation plan for the process steps that have that high RPN value. Now the mitigation plan isn't something that's required, but for something that has a high risk for any process steps, it could be very helpful to define that plan in advance. So as a team, what you could do is define a couple things. First, the recommended actions in the event of a failure, as well as the person who's responsible to perform the action and estimated turnaround time to complete that action. Now the remaining action taken items and rankings are all optional within the FMEA tool. For any process step that might have a very high risk of failure, it can help to apply a ranking in RPN for those mitigation actions in order to assess their inherent risks. So what do we do with this now? Well, the FMEA tool is something that can help unify the team around the improvements to implement as well as to build their confidence that all the potential risks that we've identified are appropriately covered within the mitigation plan. And the FMEA tool is also a way that we should keep this on hand and so that the team can have some sort of reference document and keep it distributed as well to other stakeholders who are involved as part of the process or have control over certain process steps that could be affected by this, in case you want to see the effects and any potential risk that could be affecting them as well. And then finally, if there's any process steps that have a very high risk, like again those associated with a high RPN value, then they should also be validated by any other stakeholder who's responsible for or knowledgeable of that particular respective process step.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, the FMEA is a great tool to work through in this exercise, so I would recommend that you try to identify at least a high-level process map used within your organization. But if you don't have something like that, what you could do is build a process map for a simple routine process that you might follow, such as driving to school or work, or maybe ordering a meal at a restaurant, or mowing the lawn, or something like that. But whatever process you use, then try to ensure that you at least have 3 to 5 key process steps as part of this. And then based off of that, build an FMEA using the process that you've defined. And then try to identify each of the critical process steps. And then for each of those process steps, identify all potential failure modes. And then for each of those failure modes, identify the potential effects from those failures and the severity level. And then for each of those failure effects, identify all potential causes and the occurrence frequency level. And then for each of those failure causes, identify all controls that could detect the cause and its detection level. And then try to calculate the RPN, that risk priority number, based on the severity, frequency, and detection levels that you identified. And then as needed, try filling out any remaining portion for building a mitigation plan for those items. Now, based off of this tool and how you built this out, try asking yourself the following questions. Which of those process steps had the most failure modes? And which failure modes had the highest RPN? And which process step had the highest combined RPN value based on all of its failure modes? Now, how do these results actually compare with the level of risk that you might have originally expected for this type of process?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.